The sun was a merciless hammer beating down on the cracked red earth of Red Mesa until the very colors seemed to bleed from the sky, leaving a hazy white canvas stretched taut over a world of dust and whispers. Heat shimmered in waves off the parched ground, distorting the hard-edged shapes of the town's few buildings and the saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office, into trembling apparitions. It was a place built on hardship and held together by suspicion, where silence was a currency more common than coin. Then came the sound. It began as a low thrumming, a vibration felt in the bones before it was heard. Heads lifted. The blacksmith's hammer stilled mid-swing. In the saloon, a tinny piano faltered, and laughter died in throats. People emerged from their doorways, squinting into the blinding glare of the afternoon, their faces etched with a familiar mixture of boredom and apprehension. A dust cloud, deep ochre and roiling, was rising on the horizon, moving with a speed that spoke of purpose, of urgency. Hoofbeats thundered, dust choked the air. He was here. Out of the maelstrom of grit and sun, a lone rider emerged, his form coalescing into a figure of stark, undeniable presence. He rode a powerful black warhorse, its coat matted with sweat and grime, its great chest heaving. The man himself was Apache, his features carved from the same rugged stone as the mesas that gave the town its name. His long black hair was bound by a simple leather band, and his buckskin clothing was worn but immaculate. This was Chief Cale, a name spoken in Red Mesa only in hushed tones, a specter of the wilderness that pressed in on all sides of their fragile civilization. But it was what he carried that froze the blood. Cradled against his chest, wrapped in a faded but richly patterned blanket, was a small body. A child. His son. The boy Noden was limp, his head lolling with the horse's gait, a sheen of feverish sweat slicking his dark hair to his brow. His breath was a shallow, ragged whisper, a dying ember in the vast, unforgiving heat. As Cale rode down the single desolate main street, a wave of silence spread before him. Doors slammed shut. Windows were shuttered. The townsfolk who moments before had been curious now scattered like quail, their faces masks of hostility and fear. They saw not a grieving father, but an invader, a threat. The raw, untamed world they fought so hard to keep at bay had just ridden into their heart. At the far end of town, in a small, isolated cabin, set back from the main thoroughfare, Alara felt the change in the air. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the daily clangor of town life. Her hands, stained with the green of crushed herbs, stilled over the worn wooden bowl in her lap. She was a woman who had learned to read silence. This was not the quiet of midday slumber. It was the quiet of a held breath. She rose, her movement slow and deliberate, and moved to the single window of her cabin. Through the grimy glass, she saw the scene unfolding. She saw the formidable chief, the sick child, and the town recoiling as if from a plague. Her gaze fell upon Dr. Hemlock's office, its painted sign peeling in the sun. Cale rode past it without a second glance. He passed the church, its steeple a lonely finger pointing to an empty sky. He was not seeking the town's medicine or its god. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the remaining structures, a predator seeking a specific sanctuary. And then they found her. Across the dusty expanse, through the shimmering heat, his gaze locked with hers. In that moment, the rest of Red Mesa ceased to exist. There was only the desperate father, the dying child, and the outcast woman in the window. Alara's breath caught in her throat. A cold dread, familiar and suffocating, washed over her. Her hand instinctively went to a small, worn object on the rickety table beside her, a wooden bird, whittled from a piece of cottonwood, its surface smoothed by years of anxious touch. It was a memento, a ghost of a lullaby, the only tangible thing she had left of the child she had lost. The child she had failed. The chief urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves stirring little puffs of red dust. He stopped directly in front of her small, neglected porch. The entire town was watching now, from behind curtains, and through cracks in doors, their judgment a palpable weight in the air. Kyle did not dismount. He held his son tighter, a fierce protective gesture that was also achingly tender. He looked at her, his face a stoic mask that could not quite conceal the raw agony in his eyes. His voice when he spoke was deep and resonant, carrying across the unnatural stillness. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact, a challenge. They say you are an outcast. He said his words clear and measured. They say your hands are empty, that the spirits of life have forsaken you. He paused, letting the town's cruel whispers hang in the air between them. I have come for the magic of outcasts. The word struck Alara harder than a physical blow. Magic. They had called it that once before. They had called it a curse. The townsfolk stared, their contempt radiating from their hiding places. To them, she was the Barren Midwife, a walking, breathing symbol of failure. For this man, this stranger from a world they feared to seek her out. It was an indictment of them all. Alara clutched the wooden bird in her hand, its familiar shape a painful comfort. The wood was cool against her sweaty palm. She looked from the chief's tormented face to the pale, still features of his son. She saw the faint, bluish tinge around the boy's lips, the shallow flutter of his chest. She knew that look. She had seen it once before in a mirror of her own memory, a nightmare that never ended. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of sorrow. To help was to invite more scorn, more hatred. To refuse was to become the monster they already believed her to be. The cabin was Alara's fortress and her prison. Years of isolation had honed it into a reflection of her soul, meticulously ordered on the surface, yet steeped in a profound and lingering sadness. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the single room with the mingled scents of sage chamomile and yarrow. The sharp, clean smells of healing. Tinctures and salves in neatly labeled clay pots lined the shelves, a testament to a skill she was no longer permitted to practice. The town of Red Mesa had not always shunned her. There was a time when her hands, gentle and sure, had been sought after. She had been the one to welcome new life, her quiet competence a balm in the terrifying sacred moments of birth. But that was before the night that had cleaved her life in two. The night she had labored to bring her own daughter into the world, only to be met with a devastating silence. Her child was stillborn, a perfect sleeping doll she never got to hold awake. The same night in another home, another mother had been lost, and in the tangled mess of grief and fear, the town had needed someone to blame. The midwife, who could not even save her own, had been an easy target. She became barren, cursed, an outcast. Now that curse was being challenged. Chief Kale stood on her porch, his son's life a fragile offering. The weight of his trust was heavier than all the town's scorn combined. Beside her, Silas Kane watched the scene from the window of his newly acquired office in the Assayers building. Kane was a man who moved with the chilling stillness of a serpent. He was not a native of Red Mesa. He had arrived 6 months prior with a fat leather satchel and an ambition as vast and empty as the desert itself. He dressed in tailored Eastern clothes that defied the dust, his face clean-shaven, his eyes a pale, cold gray. He had begun by buying up failed homesteads and then the water rights to the only reliable creek in the county. Now his shadow fell over everything, including the ancestral lands of Kale's people. Kane's foreman, a burly, taciturn man named Jed, stood behind him. "What's that Apache devil want with her?" Jed muttered, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Silas Kane didn't turn. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes as he watched Kale. It was not just the avarice of a land baron eyeing a rival. It was something deeper, more personal. He watched Alara, a strange, unsettling intensity in his gaze. He is making a mistake. Cain said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. A mistake he will not live to regret. He turned from the window, his expression returning to one of cool, calculated control. The final survey of the northern ridge is complete. We begin clearing it at dawn. The tribe's burial grounds are of no consequence. Sheriff Brody watched from his own office, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the grime on his temple. He was a good man, worn down by a hard land and harder compromises. He wore his badge like a burden, its silver tarnished, its authority hollow. He saw the townsfolk's fear, Cale's desperation, and he knew Cain was watching too. Brody was a man caught in the middle, a fence post in a flash flood, and he could feel the ground eroding beneath his feet. He had a deep, abiding respect for the law, but in Red Mesa, Silas Cain's word was becoming the only law that mattered. He felt a familiar knot of helplessness tighten in his gut. This situation, this impossible convergence of pain and prejudice on his main street was a powder keg, and he had a terrible feeling the fuse had just been lit. Back at the cabin, the world had shrunk to the space between Alara and the Apache chief. The silence stretched thin and brittle. Inside her, a war was raging. Her fear whispered of failure, of the town's inevitable wrath, of the agony of losing another child, even one not her own. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else stirred the healer she had once been, the woman who knew the properties of every root and leaf, whose hands knew the rhythms of life. Cale did not press her. He simply waited, his stillness a testament to his faith. He had not come to her because he had other options. He had come to her because he believed she was his only one. He saw past the town's judgment to the core of her, and in his eyes she saw not a pariah, but a last hope. Her gaze fell again to the child. Nodin's small face was contorted in a silent battle for breath. She saw the rapid, shallow pulse in the delicate skin of his throat. It was a lung fever, and a bad one. Dr. Hemlock would bleed him, purge him, and weaken him until the fever consumed him entirely. She knew a different way, a gentler way, the way of the earth. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the small wooden bird back on the table. It was a conscious act of setting aside her own grief. She took a deep breath, the air thick with dust and tension, and met Kyle's gaze. Her voice when she spoke was raspy from disuse, but steady. "Bring him inside." A collective gasp rippled through the hidden watchers of Red Mesa. Kyle's expression did not change, but a profound relief eased the rigid lines of his shoulders. With a grace that belied his size, he swung his leg over his horse and slid to the ground, never jostling the precious bundle in his arms. He mounted the 2 rickety steps of her porch and crossed her threshold, bringing the wilderness, the war, and a father's desperate love into the quiet sanctity of her small home. The door closed behind them, shutting out the prying eyes of the town. The inciting incident had passed. The outcast had accepted her charge. And in the heart of Red Mesa, an unlikely and dangerous alliance had just been forged. The moment the doors shut, the sanctuary of Alara's cabin was transformed into a crucible. The air grew thick with the labored sound of Nodin's breathing. Kyle laid his son gently on Alara's narrow cot, his large hands arranging the blanket with an almost reverent touch. The boy's skin was hot and dry, his eyes sealed shut, his small body rigid with the effort of fighting the sickness that was strangling him from within. Alara moved with a renewed purpose, the years of inactivity sloughing away like a snake's skin. "Water," she commanded softly, not looking at Cale. "And a clean cloth." Without a word, the chief moved to her water barrel, his presence filling the small space. Alara, meanwhile, lit a small fire in her hearth, and the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. She selected several clay pots, her fingers moving with an old, instinctual certainty. She took down a bundle of dried feverfew, its pungent, earthy scent filling the air, and a handful of mullein leaves, their fuzzy texture known for soothing inflamed lungs. As she worked grinding the herbs with a stone pestle, she felt the town's animosity pressing against the thin wooden walls of her cabin. She could already hear their whispers, their accusations. Witchcraft. Savage medicine. The cabin door burst open, crashing against the inside wall. Jed Silas Kane's foreman stood framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking out the afternoon light. Two other rough-looking men stood behind him, their expressions a mixture of belligerence and disgust. "What's going on in here?" Alara Jed's voice was a low growl. "Consorting with savages, now Kane won't stand for it. This town won't stand for it." Alara didn't flinch. She continued her work, her focus entirely on the herbs in her bowl. "This is my home, Jed, and this is a sick child. Get out. We heard he came to you for your magic." One of the other men sneered. "We know what kind of magic you practice. The kind that leaves graves in the dirt." The cruel barb struck home, and for a second, Alara's hands faltered. The memory of the small, unmarked mound of earth in the cemetery flashed through her mind. But before the pain could paralyze her, a figure moved with lightning speed. Kale was suddenly between her and the men, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and buckskin. He held no weapon, but his eyes burned with a fire that made Jed take an involuntary step back. "This woman is under my protection." Kale stated, his voice dangerously low. "You will not harm her. You will not hinder her." Jed's hand drifted to his pistol. "That's a threat I don't take kindly to, Chief. It is a promise." The standoff hung in the air, thick and volatile. Just then, another figure appeared in the doorway. "That's enough, Jed." Sheriff Brody stood there, his hand resting on his own sidearm, his face weary but set with a reluctant determination. He looked from Jed's angry face to Kale's impassive one, then finally to Alara. "The chief has a right to seek medical care for his boy." Brody said, his voice straining to sound authoritative. "And Alara has a right to provide it. Now all of you clear out. This is not a public spectacle." Jed glared at the sheriff, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was weighing his orders from Kane against the sheriff's badge. For a tense moment, it seemed he might challenge Brody, but then he gave a short, contemptuous laugh. "Have it your way, Sheriff. But when this goes sour, Kane will remember you stood by and let it happen. And so will this town." He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust near the doorway, and backed away, his men following suit. Brody watched them go, his relief palpable. He turned back to Alara, his expression softening. "You be careful, Alara. Kane's been stirring up trouble for weeks. He's looking for any excuse to run the Apache off that land for good. Don't you go giving him one." "I'm just trying to save a child, Sheriff," she replied quietly. "It's the only thing I know how to do." The sheriff nodded, his gaze lingering on the sick boy on the cot. He saw the desperation in the scene and felt a pang of shame for his own powerlessness. He tipped his hat and left, pulling the door gently closed behind him. For the next hour, Alara worked tirelessly. She created a poultice of the mullein and laid it on Noden's chest. She brewed a tea from the feverfew, and with Kale's help managed to get the boy to swallow a few sips of the bitter liquid. The child's fever was dangerously high, his breathing still a painful, rasping struggle. She had slowed the sickness, but she had not broken it. The infection was too deep, too aggressive. She wrung out a cool cloth and placed it on Noden's forehead, her touch gentle. Kyle watched her every move, his silence a heavy presence in the room. "He is not improving," he stated, his voice flat. Alara sighed, wiping a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "The fever is rooted deep in his lungs. My herbs can soothe it, but I need something stronger to break it. Something to purify the blood." "What is it?" Kyle asked, his eyes intent. "It's a root," she explained, her mind's eye picturing it clearly. "The settlers call it stonebreaker. It grows only in shaded, rocky soil near a constant source of water. It has small, star-shaped yellow flowers. She paused, a new and terrible realization dawning on her. I haven't seen any in years. Not since. Her voice trailed off. She knew exactly where it grew. There was only one place for miles with that combination of shade rock and water, the banks of the cool, deep creek that ran along the northern ridge. The same ridge that had belonged to Cale's people for generations. The same ridge Silas Kane had illegally and forcibly seized just 2 weeks ago. The herb she needed to save the Apache chief's son grew on land that Kane had stolen from them. The first obstacle had been overcome only to reveal another, far more dangerous one. The sun began to dip below the western mesas, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and purple. A tense quiet settled over Red Mesa, the kind that precedes a storm. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Noden's labored breaths, each one a testament to their dwindling time. Ilara explained the situation to Cale, her voice low. The Stonebreaker route is our only chance. But the land is now Kane's. He has men patrolling the fences day and night. Cale's face was grim. My warriors have watched his men. They are armed. They have orders to shoot trespassers on sight. To retrieve the route would be to risk open conflict, the very thing he had struggled to avoid, the very excuse Kane was looking for to wipe them out. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form in Ilara's mind. It involved not force, but guile. It involved Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff," she said, looking up as he appeared in her doorway again, a plate of food from the town's boarding house in his hand. He'd been checking on her every hour, a silent, worried guardian. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, avoiding her gaze. "How's the boy?" "He's holding on. But I need your help." She quickly explained the dilemma of the Stonebreaker route. "I can't ask Kyle to risk his men. It would be a massacre. But you are the law. You could demand entry. You could say you're investigating a claim of stolen property, anything." Brody ran a hand over his tired face. "Ilara, you don't know what you're asking. Kane owns half this town, including the men who pay my salary. He's not a man you demand things of. He'd laugh in my face and have Jed throw me out." The defeat in his voice was stark. "Then what is that badge?" For Ilara's voice was sharp, cutting through his excuses. "Is it just a piece of tin you polish, or does it stand for something? A child is dying, Sheriff. A child. Does Kane's law matter more than that?" Her words hit their mark. Brody flinched as if struck. He looked at Noden, a small, fragile life caught in a web of adult greed and hatred. He saw the quiet dignity in Cale's posture, the fierce determination in Ilara's eyes. And he felt a profound, corrosive shame. "What is it you really want?" Silas Brody found himself asking aloud, though no one was in the room. He had been pondering this for weeks. Kane's aggression was beyond normal avarice. It was obsessive, personal. There was a venom in his dealings with the Apache, but also a strange, cold fury directed at the town itself. And his fixation on Ilara. Brody had seen the way Kane watched her, the way he'd instructed Jed to harass her. It didn't make sense. "There's something else," Brody said, turning back to Ilara. "It's not just the land. I've seen him at the county records office, late at night. He paid old Judge Miller a hefty sum for access to the town archives. Births, deaths, deeds. He's been buying up old ledgers, some of them dating back 10 years. Why would a man like Kane care about dusty old papers?" A chill went down Ilara's spine. 10 years. The same year she had lost her daughter. The same year her life had unraveled. What could Kane possibly want with records from that time? "I need to know what he's looking for." Brody said, a new resolve hardening his voice. He was no longer just a weary peacekeeper. He was an investigator. The puzzle of Silas Kane had become a matter of life and death. I'll go see Judge Miller. I'll tell him it's part of an official inquiry. In the meantime, you keep that boy alive." He turned to Cale. "Chief, keep your men away from that ridge. Do not give Kane the fight he wants. Let me try to handle this my way first." Cale gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The healer has my word. We will wait for the lawman." The emphasis he put on the title was not lost on Brody. It was both a sign of respect and a heavy burden of expectation. While Brody headed for the judge's chambers, Alara focused on the immediate. She prepared a steam inhalation for Nodin using crushed eucalyptus leaves to help open his airways. As she worked, Kyle sat by his son's side, chanting a soft, low prayer in his native tongue. His voice a soothing, hypnotic drone. For the first time, Alara felt a sense of partnership, of shared purpose, that transcended the deep divides of their worlds. They were two parents fighting for a child, an outcast healer, and a proud chief united against the encroaching darkness. But as Alara watched the boy's chest continue its painful struggle, she knew their fragile alliance was racing against a clock they could not control. The Stonebreaker root was the key, and it was locked away behind a fence of greed and a mystery buried in the town's forgotten past. Sheriff Brody found Judge Miller in his study, a cavernous room that smelled of old paper leather and whiskey. The judge was a relic of a bygone era, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his mind still sharp despite the fog of his evening libations. "Brody," he grunted, looking up from a thick, dusty tome. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Another drunken brawl at the saloon? Something more serious, Judge. I need to know about Silas Kane. He's been buying old town records from you." The judge's eyes narrowed. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "A man's business is his own. Mr. Kane paid a fair price for some forgotten paperwork. Nothing illegal about it. What was he looking for?" Brody pressed, leaning forward. "What year?" The judge hesitated, then sighed the sound of crumbling parchment. He was very specific. He wanted everything from the spring and summer of 10 years ago. Medical ledgers from Dr. Hemlock, birth and death certificates, witness statements from the coroner's inquests, all of it. Inquests plural. A bad season, the judge said quietly, his gaze distant. A lot of sickness. And that terrible night. 2 tragedies at once. He looked at Brody. "You remember?" The night Alara's baby was born, sleeping. The same night Martha Gallagher died in childbirth. The name hit Brody like a physical blow. Martha Gallagher. He remembered her, a sweet, quiet woman new to town. Her husband had been a surveyor, a serious young man who had doted on her. They had kept to themselves. After the tragedy, the husband had vanished, consumed by his grief. No one had seen him since. What was the husband's name? Brody asked, his heart beginning to pound. Judge Miller swirled the amber liquid in his glass. It was an unusual name, an Eastern name. Kane. His name was Silas Kane. The revelation landed in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. It wasn't just about land. It was never just about the land. It was a decade-old vendetta, a festering wound of grief that had finally brought a man back to the place that had destroyed his life. Silas Kane had come home to Red Mesa to exact his revenge. Brody felt the floor drop out from under him. He stumbled back to his office, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Kane's obsessive acquisition of land and water, his campaign against the Apache, it was all a smokescreen. The true target, the epicenter of his rage, was the one person he held responsible for his wife's death, the midwife who had attended her. "Alara," he had to warn her. He burst out of his office and ran toward her cabin, the setting sun casting his long, frantic shadow before him. He found her on the porch staring out at the darkening landscape. He didn't have to say a word. She saw the look on his face. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The husband of the other woman." He's Silas Kane. Brody could only nod his breath, coming in ragged gasps. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alara clutched the porch railing for support, her knuckles white. All these years she had carried the town's scorn, believing it was born of ignorance and fear. But this was different. This was a targeted patient and deeply personal hatred. Kane hadn't been squeezing the town. He had been setting a stage. He had isolated her, stripped away her allies, and turned her home into an island of hostility. And she had never even seen it coming. The midpoint of their struggle had arrived not with a clash of arms, but with a devastating revelation of truth. The enemy was not a faceless land baron, but a ghost from her own tragic past, a man whose grief mirrored her own, but had twisted into something monstrous. And he was coming for her. The night deepened, bringing with it a restless, whispering wind that rattled the loose boards of the cabin and stirred the dust in the street. The revelation of Kane's identity settled over Alara like a shroud. Every strange glance from him, every act of aggression by his men, now made a terrifying kind of sense. He was dismantling her world piece by piece, just as he believed she had dismantled his. "We have to get that root," she said, her voice gaining a new hard edge. Fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce protective instinct. Noden's life depended on it, and now perhaps so did her own. Defiance was her only path forward. "It's too dangerous," Alara Brody argued. "Kane's not just going to have you arrested for trespassing. He'll see it as a provocation. It's what he wants. Then we won't let him see us," she countered. She turned to Kale, who had been listening to their exchange, with an unnerving stillness. "Your son is running out of time. The fever will break him by morning if we do not act. I am going for the Stonebreaker. With or without your help, Sheriff." Kale stepped forward. "I will not let you go alone." But the sheriff is right. A direct approach is a fool's path. He looked out into the darkness. "My people know that land. We know its shadows. We know the paths the deer walk, the gullies the rain carves. Kane's men watch the fence, but they do not watch the earth beneath it." A plan was forged in the flickering lamplight, a desperate, stealthy mission. Kyle would guide Alara onto the property through a drainage culvert that ran under the main fence line, a passage too small for a man on horseback, but wide enough for them to crawl through. Brody, against his better judgment but bound by his resurgent conscience, would create a diversion, drawing the attention of the patrols on the far side of the property by feigning a search for rustlers. They moved under the cloak of a moonless sky. Kyle was a phantom in the darkness, his feet making no sound on the rocky ground. Alara followed close behind her heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She carried a small leather pouch for the roots and a trowel. Brody had already ridden off, and in the distance they could hear him shouting his voice, carrying on the wind, followed by the sound of hoofbeats as Kane's men took the bait. The culvert was dark and narrow, with the air thick with the smell of damp earth. They emerged on the other side into the forbidden territory. Kane's land. The air here felt different, heavy with menace. They moved quickly and quietly, Kale leading them along the creek bed, and the sound of the gurgling water masking their footsteps. Alara's eyes scanned the banks. Finally, she saw them a small patch of delicate, star-shaped yellow flowers glowing faintly in the starlight. The Stonebreaker. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her weak. She knelt, her hands sinking into the cool, damp soil, and began to dig carefully with the trowel, her movements swift and practiced. As she worked, Kale stood watch, his body tensed. Suddenly, he held up a hand. "Someone is coming." Alara froze. They heard the crunch of boots on gravel, the low murmur of voices. Two of Kane's men, having circled back from the diversion, were making a final sweep. A lantern beam cut through the darkness, swinging back and forth, getting closer. They pressed themselves into the deep shadows of a rocky outcrop, scarcely daring to breathe. The light washed over the spot where they had been standing just moments before. "See anything?" one man asked. "Nothing." "Brody's chasing ghosts again," the other grumbled. "Let's get back to the bunkhouse. It's cold out here." Their voices faded as they moved on. Alara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But as the lantern light had swept past, it had illuminated something on the ground near the creek, a small, smoldering campfire, and next to it, a piece of paper half burned. Once the men were gone, Kyle crept forward and retrieved it. He brought it back to Alara. In the faint starlight, they could just make out the writing. It was a letter, the penmanship elegant but strained. Much of it was scorched away, but a few phrases remained seared into the page and into Alara's memory. Her negligence. The child, our sweet Anna. She let you both die. The midwife with her empty hands will pay. Red Mesa will pay. The name. Anna. That was the name he had chosen for their daughter. Alara stared at the charred words, a confirmation of Cain's sick and twisted motive. He believed she had not just failed, but that she had actively, negligently allowed his wife and child to perish. He was a man drowning in a sea of grief, and he had chosen her as his anchor, determined to pull her down with him. She carefully folded the fragile remnant of the letter and placed it in her pouch alongside the precious roots. It was not just medicine she carried now, but proof. Proof of Cain's madness, and perhaps the only thing that could save her from it. A brutal wind howled down from the mesas, carrying with it a tide of red dust that scoured the landscape and blotted out the stars. A sandstorm. It descended upon Red Mesa with a furious, suffocating force, turning the world outside into a roiling, blinding chaos. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling windows and tearing at the very foundations of the town. Inside Alara's cabin, the storm was a distant roar. She worked by the steady light of a single lantern, her hands a blur of motion, as she crushed the stonebreaker root and prepared the powerful decoction. Nodin's breathing was now terrifyingly shallow, his life hanging by the slenderest of threads. Sheriff Brody burst through the door, a gust of sand and wind chasing him inside. "Alara, you have to get out of town." Now he yelled over the storm. "Cain knows you were on his land. One of his men found the trowel you dropped. He's on his way here. He's lost his mind." But it was too late. The heavy stomp of boots on her porch announced their arrival. The door was thrown open again. Silas Cain stood there, his fine clothes whipped by the wind, his face a pale mask of cold fury. Jed and two other men stood behind him, their pistols drawn. The raging storm outside was a perfect mirror for the emotional tempest that had just breached her walls. "Good evening, Midwife," Cain said, his voice cutting through the gale, chillingly calm. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He wasn't talking about the root. "The only thing I have here is a dying child." Alara shot back, her fear eclipsed by a wave of defiant anger. She stood protectively in front of the cot. "Another one," Cain said with a soft, cruel smile. "You seem to make a habit of it." "Silas, stop this." Brody warned, his hand moving toward his gun. "This has gone far enough." "Stay out of this, Sheriff," Jed snarled, leveling his pistol at Brody's chest. The physical stakes were set. They were trapped. The town saloon was the only building large enough and sturdy enough to offer real shelter from the storm's fury. The few patrons who had been caught out had gathered there along with a shaken Dr. Hemlock, who had been on his way home. The door flew open, and Cain's men shoved Alara, Brody, and a stoic, watchful Cale inside. Cain herded them toward the center of the room, his movements precise and deliberate. He had brought his personal reckoning to a public stage. "Everyone will bear witness to this," Cain announced to the terrified townsfolk. He turned his cold gray eyes on Alara. The saloon's mantelpiece clock ticked loudly in the tense silence each second, a hammer blow counting down toward an unknown fate. This was the climax. 10 years ago on this very night, my wife Martha was giving birth to our daughter Cain, began his voice resonating with a decade of repressed grief. We were new here. We were told there was a midwife, a woman with gifted hands. He spat the words like poison. I entrusted the two most precious things in my life to you. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. And you let them die. You were tired, you were distracted by your own loss, and you let my Martha bleed. You let my Anna's heart stop beating. You, the barren midwife, with your empty, useless hands, destroyed my family. The accusation hung in the thick, dusty air. The townsfolk stared, their old suspicions ignited by Cain's venomous certainty. Alara felt the weight of their judgment, the final crushing blow. That's not true, she whispered, her throat tight. I did everything I could. Liar Cain roared, his composure finally cracking. His hand flew to the pistol at his hip. He's telling the truth. She is a liar. The voice came from the corner of the room. It was Dr. Hemlock. He was pale, trembling, his face a ruin of guilt. He stumbled forward, his eyes wild. But she's not the one who lied, he choked out, his voice cracking with emotion. Everyone turned to him. Cain stared, confused. It was me, the doctor confessed, tears streaming down his face. I was the liar. This was the secondary twist, the final unexpected gear grinding into place. I was at the Gallagher house that night. Hemlock stammered, his words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt. Martha's labor was difficult. I was called. But I had been drinking. Heavily. I was drunk and I was arrogant. I made a mistake. A terrible, fatal error during the delivery. I caused the hemorrhage. I tried to fix it, but I only made it worse. He looked at Cain, his eyes pleading. Alara tried to stop me. She saw I was unfit. She begged me to let her take over, but I pushed her aside. I was the town doctor. I wouldn't be questioned by a midwife. His voice broke. When it was over, when they were gone, I was a coward. I let the whispers start. I let the town blame the grieving woman who had just lost her own child. It was easier than admitting I was a drunk and a murderer. The confession sucked the air from the room. The ticking of the clock was the only sound. Silas Cain stared at the doctor, his face slack with disbelief. The entire foundation of his 10-year crusade of hatred and the righteous fury that had fueled his every action had just crumbled into dust. He had directed his life's rage at the wrong person. He had terrorized an innocent woman, a fellow sufferer of that night's tragedy. He looked at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time, and in her eyes he saw not a monster, but a reflection of his own profound loss. The truth had not offered him vengeance, but a mirror to his own soul's corruption. The emotional storm inside him was now more violent than the one raging outside. He let out a sound, a choked, agonized cry of a man utterly and completely broken. In the stunned silence that followed Dr. Hemlock's confession, the balance of power in the saloon shifted irrevocably. Jed and Cain's other men looked from their shattered employer to Sheriff Brody, their bravado evaporating in the face of the raw, ugly truth. Brody, seizing the moment, finally found the courage that had eluded him for so long. His gun was in his hand, steady and sure, pointed not at Jed, but directly at Silas Cain. It's over. Silas Brody's voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable weight of renewed authority. Silas Cain, I'm arresting you for assault, for incitement of violence, and for the conspiracy to illegally seize land and water rights. Cain didn't even seem to hear him. He was a hollow shell, his eyes vacant, staring at a past he could no longer comprehend. Jed, seeing his paycheck and his power vanish, made a move to raise his pistol, but a blur of motion from the shadows stopped him. Cale, who had remained a silent observer throughout the confrontation, now stood beside him, one hand clamped around Jed's wrist with crushing force. Jed's gun clattered to the floor. The other men, seeing their leader defeated and their foreman disarmed, wisely raised their hands in surrender. The sandstorm began to subside as quickly as it had arrived, its fury spent. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh. Through the saloon's dusty windows, the first hints of a bruised dawn began to filter through. Ilara's only thought was of Nodin. Without a word, she pushed past the stunned crowd and ran from the saloon, clutching the pouch of medicine. Kyle was right behind her. They burst into the cabin to a terrifying silence. Nodin was no longer breathing. His chest was still. For a heart-stopping second, Ilara thought she was too late. But she refused to surrender. She worked with frantic speed, forcing the potent stonebreaker decoction drop by drop between the boy's blue-tinged lips. She massaged his chest, breathing into his mouth, whispering words of encouragement, of life, of defiance. "Come back, little one. Fight. You must fight." For a long moment, nothing happened. Kyle stood over them, his face carved from stone, preparing himself for the ultimate loss. Then a shudder ran through Nodin's small body, a tiny sputtering cough, and then a breath, a deep, ragged, beautiful breath followed by another. The color began to return to his cheeks. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, and then settled on his father's face. "Father," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. The stone facade of the chief finally broke. Tears welled in Cale's eyes as he knelt and gathered his son into his arms, holding him with a tenderness that filled the small cabin with a light all its own. He looked at Ilara over his son's head, and the gratitude in his eyes was more profound than any words could ever be. An alliance of respect, forged in desperation and sealed in healing, was now unbreakable. News of the night's events spread through Red Mesa like a grass fire. The townsfolk, emerging into the clean, scrubbed post-storm air, saw things differently. They saw Sheriff Brody no longer a man of compromise, but a true lawman marching a broken Silas Kane and his men to the town's jail cells. They heard the story of Dr. Hemlock's confession and Ilara's complete exoneration. The guilt of a community that had wronged one of its own began to settle in. They looked at Ilara's small cabin not with suspicion, but with a newfound, shamefaced awe. The outcast had saved them from themselves. Weeks turned into a month. The autumn sun was gentler now, its light golden and forgiving. Red Mesa was a changed town. The grip of fear that Kane had held over it was broken, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of community. With Kane's fraudulent claims nullified by Sheriff Brody, the land and water rights were returned to their rightful owners, including Cale's people. A formal truce was drawn not on paper, but in the daily interactions of two cultures learning to see each other not as threats, but as neighbors. Ilara was at the center of this quiet transformation. Her cabin was no longer a place of isolation. A shy knock on her door was now a daily occurrence. A mother seeking a remedy for her child's cough, a farmer asking for a salve for a rope, a young couple wanting her blessing for their unborn baby. They came to her not for magic, but for her wisdom, her skill, her compassion. She was no longer the Barren Midwife. She was simply Ilara the healer. One crisp, clear afternoon, she walked through the town, a basket of herbs on her arm. People nodded to her, smiling. The blacksmith called out a friendly greeting. Children who once would have run from her now waved. She had not sought their acceptance, but in healing Nodin, she had healed a deeper sickness within the town itself. Her walk took her to the edge of town, to the small, neglected cemetery on the hill. The wind whispered through the tall, dry grass that grew between the weathered headstones. She walked past the marked graves of Red Mesa's founders and families until she reached a lonely corner of the plot. Here there were two small, unmarked mounds of earth side by side. One was her daughter's. The other, she had learned from the town records Brody had recovered, was for a baby girl named Anna Kane. Two children born and lost on the same tragic night. their fates unknowingly intertwined by a decade of lies and misplaced grief. From her pocket, Alara took out the small, worn wooden bird. Its surface was a testament to 10 years of sorrow, its smooth contours shaped by a mother's endless silent mourning. It was the last piece of the broken woman she had been. She knelt in the soft dirt between the two small graves. For a moment, she held the bird to her cheek, a final quiet farewell. Then, with a gentle, deliberate motion, she placed it on the earth, a simple wooden offering, bridging the space between the two lost children. It was an act of peace, of forgiveness, and of shared loss. It was an acknowledgement that grief, in the end, respects no boundaries. A sense of profound release washed over her, a quiet peace she had not felt in a decade. The weight she had carried for so long was finally lifted. She stood up and looked out from the hilltop over the town of Red Mesa. It was still a hard place in a hard land, but it was no longer a place of ghosts for her. It was a community. It was a home. She turned away from the graves, her hands no longer clutching a painful memento of the past, but open and ready to embrace the future. She walked back toward the town, her steps light, her spirit healed.